No ship appeared on the scanners, no hyperspace signature registered. The Imperial listening post orbiting the gas giant Vordune Prime detected only a brief, violent distortion in the gravity well at the edge of its sensor range. A ripple in the void that made seasoned technicians blink and recheck their instruments. Space did not tear open the way it did when a vessel emerged from hyperspace. There was no familiar blue-white tunnel, no flicker of starlight stretched into impossible lines. There was only a wound in the darkness, a momentary absence where the galaxy seemed to forget itself. Then something fell out of it. The object was not a ship. It was too small, too fast, too erratic. It burned like a meteor for a fraction of a second as it intersected with the thin particulate haze of the system's outer ring, trailing ionized debris. And the sensors struggled to classify it. Mass readings spiked, then stabilized. Energy output flared, then dipped into patterns no Imperial database could match. The object slowed, arrested its own momentum in open vacuum with no visible propulsion, and hovered against the velvet black of space. On the main observation deck, Lieutenant Arkin Voss felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had served on 3 different deep space listening posts, watched pirate skirmishes, separatist holdouts, crushed under Star Destroyer guns, even the silent aftermath of an Inquisitor's purge. None of it compared to the unease that settled over him now. The thing outside the viewport did not belong. The galaxy had rules, hyperspace lanes, mass shadows, gravity wells, the comforting predictability of known physics, bent but understood. This presence felt like a violation of those rules, as though someone had scribbled over reality with careless ink. "Magnify," Voss ordered. The holoprojector resolved the shape into something humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso wrapped in fabric that caught the distant starlight. A cape drifted behind the figure, rippling in microcurrents of disturbed vacuum. No helmet, no visible breathing apparatus. The face was still too distant to read clearly, but the posture was unmistakable, upright, composed, almost casual, as though the void itself were a stage and the figure had stepped into the spotlight. "Sir," one of the sensor officers said quietly, fingers dancing over the console. "Life signs confirmed, but they don't match any known species profile, and he's not in a pressure suit." Voss swallowed. "Run a full threat assessment, notify Sector Command, and get me the ISB. Now." The figure turned. It was a small movement, a subtle shift of orientation, but the effect was immediate and visceral. A ripple of unease passed through the command deck, the irrational sensation of being watched, weighed, and found wanting. Even through layers of transparasteel and durasteel, Voss felt as though the stranger's gaze had locked onto him personally. The figure raised one hand, not in greeting, not in warning, but in a loose, almost bored gesture. In the vacuum of space there was no sound, but on the far edge of the listening post's defensive perimeter, something detonated. A pirate corvette, one of the countless scavenger vessels that haunted the fringes of Imperial territory, had chosen the worst possible moment to test what it assumed was an underdefended relay station. Its ion cannons flared, blue-white bolts streaking toward the listening post's shield envelope. The first volley never reached its target. The humanoid figure blurred, not moved, blurred. The distance between the figure and the corvette collapsed in an instant, a streak of motion so fast the sensors lagged behind it, frames dropping as if reality itself had stuttered. A lance of crimson light erupted from the figure's eyes, cutting through the corvette's forward hull as though it were parchment. The beam carved a molten line across the vessel's superstructure, venting atmosphere, igniting fuel reserves. The pirate ship split in two, the halves tumbling away in opposite directions, fire blooming silently along the torn metal edges. On the bridge of the listening post, every officer froze. The second pirate escort tried to brake and run, engines flaring as it veered toward the shadow of Vor'dun Prime. The figure did not pursue immediately. It hovered for a heartbeat, as though considering whether the fleeing vessel was worth the effort. Then it vanished again, reappearing directly in front of the corvette's path. A clenched fist drove through the cockpit canopy. The ship's nose crumpled, momentum carrying it forward until the figure planted both feet against the hull and forced it to a dead stop. The corvette folded in on itself, metal screaming in silence as structural integrity failed. Debris scattered across the void like the bones of something devoured. The figure released the wreckage and drifted back, cape settling behind him. He looked, for a moment, almost disappointed. "Sir," the sensor officer whispered, "the pirates are gone." Voss did not answer. His mouth had gone dry. He had seen Jedi deflect blaster bolts, had watched holo recordings of Sith tearing through battalions with the Force. This was different. There'd been no lightsaber, no visible Force manipulation, just raw, obscene power applied with casual contempt. "Transmit everything to Coruscant," Voss said finally. "Full sensor data, visuals, threat profile, flag it as existential." Across the galaxy, in the polished obsidian halls of the Imperial Palace, till the holographic projection flickered to life before a semicircle of robed analysts and rigidly postured officers. The image stabilized on the magnified feed of the listening post's viewport, a solitary figure suspended against the stars, cape drifting like a banner of conquest. The Emperor's throne room was dim, lit by the cold glow of city lights bleeding in through towering windows. Traffic lanes glittered far below, like rivers of light, across Coruscant's endless cityscape. Darth Vader stood at the base of the dais, hands clasped behind his back, the faint rhythm of his respirator underscoring the tension in the air. Emperor Palpatine leaned forward slightly, yellow eyes gleaming with interest. "So," he murmured, voice a silken rasp, "this is the anomaly." The ISB director cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, our analysts confirm the entity is biological. It exhibits no reliance on technology for vacuum survival or propulsion. Energy emissions from its ocular region are unprecedented. The destruction of the pirate vessels was achieved without conventional weapons." "A living weapon," Palpatine mused. "How quaint." Vader's helm tilted minutely. Through the Force he felt it, a pressure, distant but undeniable. Not a presence like a Jedi's or a Sith's, not a luminous thread in the vast web of the Force. This was something else, a void within the current, a stone dropped into water that refused to ripple as it should. "It does not feel bound to the Force," Vader said, "but it moves within it." Palpatine's thin smile widened. "Everything moves within the Force, my friend. The question is whether this creature can be made to move where we desire." Out in the empty reaches near Vor'dun Prime, the figure hovered alone, eyes scanning the unfamiliar stars. In his own world, the sky had been crowded with satellites, contrails, the constant buzz of human activity. Here, The cosmos felt vast and indifferent, dotted with distant suns that meant nothing to him. Homelander smiled. The name came to him as a reflex, an anchor to a reality that suddenly felt very far away. He remembered the flash of light, the tearing sensation in his gut as the air itself had seemed to fold around him. One moment, he had been above a city that worshipped him in equal parts, fear and adoration. The next, he was here, adrift in a galaxy that did not know his name. He rolled his shoulders, testing the familiar hum of power beneath his skin. Strength coiled in his muscles, that heat gathered behind his eyes at a thought. He felt different, not weaker. If anything, the strange energy that permeated this place prickled against his senses, like static before a storm. It made his hearing catch fragments of distant transmissions, alien languages carried on radio waves he instinctively filtered out. It made his skin tingle, as though the universe itself were aware of him. Not Kansas, he muttered to no one. The pirate ships had been an annoyance. Predators, the kind that thrived in lawless gaps. He had erased them because it was easy, and because it felt good to remind himself that no matter where he was still the apex. The reactions from the listening post amused him more. Fear traveled faster than light in its own way. He could almost taste it through the vacuum. Far away, the engines flared as Imperial patrol craft began to reposition, forming cautious vectors around the sector. Homelander watched them gather, the rigid geometry of their approach betraying military doctrine. An empire, then. That was interesting. Empires understood power. They worshipped it, even when they pretended otherwise. He drifted closer to the listening post, slow enough this time that their sensors could track him. He wanted them to see him coming, wanted the galaxy to take a good long look. Inside the station, alarms chimed. Voss straightened, every instinct screaming at him to run even as protocol demanded he stand his ground. The figure resolved into clearer detail now, blonde hair floating in a perfect, infuriatingly calm halo. A face carved into a confident, almost heroic expression. Side eyes that burned with a barely contained cruelty. The figure raised a hand and placed it gently against the transparasteel viewport. The barrier held. For now. Voss felt the pressure in his chest, the animal certainty that this was not a being you negotiated with from a position of whackness. This was not a Jedi, not a Sith. This was something older in instinct, simpler in philosophy, a god that demanded recognition. And across the void, Homelander's smile widened as he felt the subtle hum of energy in the barrier resisting him. New rules, new toys, a new audience. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, smash that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The Force protects those who support this channel. Homelander's eyes flared red. Homelander did not strike the viewport. Not yet. He let the red glare fade from his eyes, studying the faint distortions where the station's shields met the transparasteel. He could feel the resistance there, the subtle vibration of energy fields, tuned to disperse kinetic impact and thermal discharge. Clever. Not clever enough, but clever. The galaxy he'd fallen into wasn't defenseless. That pleased him. Games were more fun when the pieces fought back. Inside the listening post, Lieutenant Voss forced himself to breathe. Training said maintain posture, maintain command presence. but the part of him that had grown up on Outer Rim worlds, where myths of Sith and monsters haunted the dark between settlements, was screaming that whatever hovered beyond the viewport was older than fear and newer than any nightmare he'd learned to name. "For'ard, open a channel," Voss said. His voice cracked on the first word. He steadied it with effort. "If it can hear us, I want it to hear us." The comms officer hesitated. "Sir, we don't know if it communicates." "Open the channel." Static hissed, then the faint hum of open transmission. Voss stepped closer to the viewport, his reflection a pale ghost overlaid on the impossible figure beyond the glass. "This is Lieutenant Arkin Voss of the Imperial Listening Post, Aurek Theta," he said, forcing authority into each syllable. "You are in restricted Imperial space. Identify yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Homelander's lips moved. Sound, of course, did not travel through vacuum, but the station's external sensors picked up minute vibrations in the energy field where his voice pressed against the barrier. The translators, confused but persistent, attempted to map patterns to known phonetic structures. The result crackled through the comm speakers, distorted but intelligible enough to chill the room. "Imperial?" the voice echoed, warped as though filtered through water. "That's cute. You guys the good guys or the bad guys?" Voss stared. The question, absurd in its simplicity, hit harder than any threat display. "We are the lawful authority in this sector," he said. "State your identity and purpose." Homelander tilted his head, eyes flicking over the station's exterior defenses, the mounted turbo-laser emplacements, the docking rings. "Lawful authority," he repeated. "You wear the uniforms. You've got the big guns. That usually means you're the bad guys pretending to be the good guys." A ripple of unease moved through the bridge crew. Voss clenched his jaw. "You destroyed 2 vessels in Imperial space without authorization." "They were shooting at you," Homelander replied, sounding almost bored. "You're welcome." There it was, that casual dismissal of life, of consequence. Voss had heard that tone in the mouths of inquisitors, in the cold debriefings of ISB agents who treated whole populations as variables. But this was different. This was naked entitlement. "Your actions have been recorded," Voss said. "Imperial forces are en route. You will comply with their instructions." Homelander laughed. The sound that filtered through the comms was low, amused, and entirely without warmth. "You're adorable when you threaten me." He pulled his hand away from the viewport and drifted back, giving the station a last, appraising look. Then, with a sonic crack that rippled through the station's sensor net, he accelerated away, vanishing into the star field. The bridge erupted into noise. Alarms, overlapping reports, the frantic chatter of officers trying to track a target that had already slipped beyond their effective range. Voss sagged against the console, the adrenaline crash leaving him hollow. Somewhere deep in his gut, a certainty had taken root. This encounter was not over. It was the opening move in something vast and terrible. The first Imperial response group arrived within the hour. 2 Arquitans-class light cruisers and a screen of TIE fighters, their solar panels cutting sharp silhouettes against the gas giant's bands. They found nothing but drifting wreckage and the faint residue of energy distortions that baffled even seasoned technicians. Reports flowed up the chain of command, through Sector Command, through the ISB's black channels, until they reached the Emperor's inner circle. Palpatine listened to the summaries with rapt attention, fingers steepled, eyes alight with predatory curiosity. He speaks, the Emperor mused. He reasons. He has preferences. This is not a beast. This is a mind that can be shaped. Vader said nothing. The impression of the anomaly lingered in his senses like an itch he could not scratch. On the Force bent around that presence in subtle, disquieting ways, as though acknowledging it without embracing it. He had faced Jedi masters, ancient Sith spirits, even creatures whose very existence was a wound in the Force. This felt adjacent, a power source parallel to the current, moving alongside it without ever fully joining. "Track him," Palpatine commanded softly. "I want to know where our guest goes next." Homelander did not travel by hyperspace lanes. He didn't need them. He moved through real space, leaping vast distances in moments, orienting himself by the pull of gravity wells and the faint electromagnetic whispers of inhabited systems. The galaxy was loud in ways his own world had never been. Countless transmissions, navigation beacons, the hum of energy shields and reactor cores. It took effort to tune it out. He to focus on the patterns that mattered. He found his first world by accident. A smuggler convoy, running spice along an unregistered route, blundered into his path. The freighters were old Corellian designs, scarred by micrometeor impacts and patched with mismatched plating. Their escorts, a handful of retrofitted Z-95 headhunters, broke formation when they saw him, pilots shouting over open comms in half a dozen languages. Homelander hovered in their midst, arms folded, cape drifting lazily. The fear was palpable even through the vacuum, the pilots' heart rates spiking as their targeting systems failed to lock onto him properly. He could hear them now, fragments of panic bleeding through their comm channels. "What is that thing?" "No transponder. By the stars, it's just a man." He smiled. The old, familiar thrill of being seen, of being feared, curled in his chest. "Relax," he said, broadcasting his voice across their open frequencies with a crude but effective manipulation of the electromagnetic spectrum. "I'm not here for you." One of the escorts fired anyway. The blaster bolt splashed harmlessly against his chest, dissipating in a wash of heat that barely warmed his skin. Homelander sighed. "You guys always do that." He flicked 2 fingers. The escort spun away, control surfaces shredded by a pinpoint burst of heat vision that left the pilot alive but adrift, systems screaming. The rest of the convoy scattered, hyperspace drives flaring as they fled. Left alone with the crippled escort, Homelander drifted closer. The pilot, a young woman judging by the shape of her face behind the cracked canopy, stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Don't worry," he said gently. "I'm not a monster." He ripped the canopy free. She screamed. The sound cut off as he crushed the cockpit with one hand, metal folding around her like paper. The scream ended in a wet, abrupt silence. Homelander released the wreckage and watched it tumble into the void. The thrill ebbed, leaving behind a faint, irritating hollowness. Fear was nice. Control was better. Worship. That was the goal. In his own world, the adoration of millions had been a constant hum beneath his skin, a validation of his place at the top of the food chain. Here, he was unknown. That would not do. He turned toward the nearest gravity well that suggested a populated world and accelerated. The outer rim planet of Karen's Reach was a dust-choked backwater, its settlements clinging to life around moisture farms and the occasional strip mining operation. Crime syndicates carved the planet into fiefdoms, huts and their lieutenants extracting tribute in spice and blood. The Empire maintained a token presence, a garrison in the capital city, more concerned with tax quotas than the suffering of the locals. Homelander arrived like a falling star. His descent burned a furrow through the upper atmosphere, a streak of fire visible for hundreds of kilometers. He landed in the central plaza of the capital with a shockwave that shattered windows and threw pedestrians to the ground. Dust billowed, alarms wailed, and blaster rifles came up in shaking hands as stormtroopers rushed to contain what they assumed was an orbital strike survivor. Homelander stood in the settling haze, the cape draped over one shoulder, boots planted in cracked bureaucracy. He inhaled, the air dry and acrid in his lungs, and smiled at the ring of white armor forming around him. "Hi," he said. The stormtroopers opened fire. Blaster bolts hammered into him, splashing across his chest and face in bursts of red light. He didn't flinch. The plaza fell silent as the troopers realized, one by one, that their weapons were useless. Homelander's eyes glowed. When the dust settled, there were no stormtroopers left standing. The people of Karen's Reach watched from doorways and shattered windows as the stranger turned his gaze on the crime lord's palace at the far end of the plaza. A squat, fortified structure, flying the sigil of a Hutt clan. He lifted into the air, hovering above the city like an avenging angel from some forgotten myth. "Your masters," his voice boomed across the plaza, amplified by the city's own comm towers as he hijacked their broadcast systems, "have been lying to you. They tell you the Empire protects you. They tell you the Hutts keep order. They tell you this is the best you can hope for." He extended one hand toward the palace. "I can do better." The palace exploded. In the aftermath, as the fires burned and the syndicate's enforcers lay broken, the people of Karen's Reach fell to their knees. Some wept, some stared in stunned silence, some whispered prayers to gods they had not spoken to in years. Homelander drank it in. If this galaxy wanted a ruler, he would give them one. And far away, in the shadowed halls of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Palpatine felt the first tremor of something that threatened to slip beyond his control. The outer rim simmered in tension the galaxy had rarely seen. News of Homelander's actions on Karen's Reach had spread faster than any Imperial comm suppression could manage. Holo recordings from smuggler networks, black market feeds, and illicit transmission relays painted a terrifying picture. A man who wielded power like a god, indifferent to life, bending entire worlds to his whims in moments. Every crime lord, minor Imperial governor, and opportunistic merchant recalculated their survival chances. Even local planetary security forces, barely more than militia, shivered at the implications. If this being could conquer Karen's Reach so effortlessly, no system was safe. Homelander moved with calculated precision. His superhuman speed allowed him to survey the outer rim in hours, mapping the territories, noting Imperial garrisons, criminal enclaves, and rebel sympathizers. Each observation reinforced a simple truth. Power here was fragmented, slow, and untested against an apex predator, and none of it best posed a serious threat. He had already drawn his first conclusion. Domination required more than fear. It required narrative, influence. The people of the Outer Rim needed to believe that he was inevitable, untouchable, and above all existing authorities. The Empire, the Hutts, even scattered crime gangs were variables he could exploit. But none were threats that could oppose him if provoked. Patience was part of the game. Myths required cultivation before reality interfered. In the shadowed alleys of Karen's Reach, the Hutts and their underlings convened. Smoke coiled from the ruined palace, filling the air with a bitter haze. Members of Black Sun, Pike syndicates, and lesser crime families gathered, calculating risk and opportunity as they awaited the inevitable. The Hutt Lord presiding over the meeting, a massive slug-like figure mottled in green, bellowed through translators that buzzed with distortion. "Disaster! You bring disaster to my holdings." His voice reverberated through the chamber. "This creature destroys our assets, and he is not even of this galaxy." A Pike lieutenant hissed. "Perhaps we can offer gifts, tribute, show submission." The Hutt waved dismissively. "Tribute? Tribute is fire to the storm. He is not an eater of credits. He consumes order, loyalty, everything you pretend to control. You cannot bribe him." "Then what?" a Black Sun captain demanded. "Do we fight?" The Hutt laughed, a wet, guttural sound. "Fight a god? I would sooner slit my throat. No, when we survive by hiding, by waiting, by praying he leaves us scraps while he moves on to larger prey." The room was tense. Every minor crime lord recognized that survival meant obscurity, invisibility, and patience. But patience was fragile when the unknown god watched and waited. Far above the Outer Rim, aboard the Executor, the Imperial chain of command moved with urgency. Emperor Palpatine, amused and intrigued, dispatched observation fleets rather than engaging directly. If this anomaly could be harnessed, it might destabilize sectors the Empire struggled to control. If it could not, it would serve as a warning, proof that even Palpatine's reach had limits. Darth Vader meditated in the depths of the Executor's chamber. He could feel the energy of the anomaly through the Force. Potent, alien, and arrogantly uncontrolled. Every step Homelander took across the Outer Rim sent ripples through the Force that Vader could not fully analyze. This was untrained power, yet absolute. It did not bend to light or dark. It existed in parallel, a current that disrupted the galaxy's natural flow. "Master," an aide said, bowing. "He is consolidating control over Karen's Reach. Civilians prostrate themselves before him. Imperial forces are disarrayed." Vader's fist clenched. "He will not stop there. He will test every system. He will confront the Empire itself, if allowed. Prepare contingency fleets. Observe. Intervene only when necessary." Palpatine's voice hissed through the holocom. "Do not provoke him unnecessarily, Lord Vader. Let him demonstrate the extent of his strength. When the time comes, the galaxy will kneel once more, and we will control how he falls." Vader knew the Emperor's fascination was dangerous. Observing this being was a risk that could destabilize entire sectors. Or worse, grant Homelander the experience to challenge even the Empire itself. Not all were cowed. In the ruined alleys of Karen's Reach, a small rebel cell watched the chaos. Armed with stolen blasters, datapads, and homemade explosives, they moved silently, plotting containment. Kyle Torin, a wiry former soldier and ladder of the cell, observed the plaza from atop a damaged communications tower. "He's not just powerful," Kyle whispered. "He's perfect, too perfect, and the people love him." Viranos, His lieutenant and former slicer shook her head. Love? They fear him? Don't confuse worship with terror. Kyle's jaw tightened. Hunt's fear is temporary. Worship is permanent. If we do nothing, the Outer Rim bends before him. The rebellion will lose influence, perhaps irreversibly. A young recruit asked, voice trembling, "How do we fight someone like that?" Kyle's eyes narrowed. "We don't fight directly. We force him to make choices, create friction, exploit his need to dominate. That's the only way." The rebels began mapping systems, plotting routes and safe houses, preparing a guerrilla resistance designed to frustrate and confine him rather than confront him head-on. Homelander traveled between nearby systems, striking with precision. On Syndralis, a major smuggling hub, he collapsed loading docks, leaving shipments intact but obliterating the infrastructure. On Rylock 5, he destroyed oppressive overseer facilities, while freeing slaves while humiliating the Empire's token forces. Every action reinforced the narrative. He was absolute. The citizens of each world witnessed the consequences of defiance and the rewards of recognition. Fear and awe merged into worship. Even minor Imperial officers in isolated posts began filing reports that hinted at panic. Subject appears immune to standard ordnance, displays behavior suggesting intelligence beyond human norms. Civilians revere him. Palpatine's spies and Vader's informants all noted the same, a growing cult of personality forming around the anomaly. From orbit around Karen's reach, Vader reviewed data and felt the Force disturbances. Homelander's displays were not random. He learned quickly, adapted to resistance, and employed both psychological and physical control. His alien mind absorbed patterns, adjusted strategy, and executed actions that Imperial tacticians could barely comprehend. Palpatine's voice echoed, "Do you sense it, Lord Vader? The thread weaving across the Outer Rim. He does not bend to force or fear, yet every choice can be interpreted, exploited. Study him. When the time comes, we will bend him or break him." Vader remained silent. The anomaly's growing mythos disturbed him. Homelander was teaching the Outer Rim that even Imperial authority could be trivialized. Observation and patience were all he had. Mandalorian interest Homelander sensed observation before he saw it. A squad of Mandalorians, Beskar-clad and silent, tracked him across several systems. They studied, waited, and calculated. He allowed them to watch, as their armor reflected light, but revealed nothing of intent. Speaking through disrupted communication fields, he addressed them. "I know you're watching. You could strike, but you haven't. Why?" A measured voice came from one helmet. "We measure strength, not fear. You are interesting." Homelander's smile widened. Interesting keeps life exciting. The standoff continued in orbit above a barren asteroid. Mandalorians were formidable, disciplined, armed with technology that could pierce most armor. But Homelander's alien power defied analysis. Every tactic they employed was anticipated, countered, or absorbed with minimal effort. The standoff ended without bloodshed. The Mandalorians withdrew, leaving traces of surveillance devices, each neutralized silently by Homelander. Homelander continued moving through Outer Rim systems, as consolidating control. On each planet, he made deliberate, terrifying displays of dominance, striking fear into the corrupt, rewarding cooperation, and cultivating myth. By now, the outer systems whispered of a god among men, a figure whose power dwarfed the Empire, and whose presence unsettled both criminal networks and local militias. Every act, every show of power, increased both loyalty and fear. He was becoming more than a legend. He was a force reshaping the galaxy's political and psychological landscape. On Coruscant, the Emperor and his council watched developments with keen interest. Palpatine instructed Imperial governors to avoid engagement unless the anomaly's actions threatened Imperial core worlds. Observation fleets shadowed Homelander's path, studying his patterns, limits, and preferences. Vader meditated, feeling the alien power stretch across systems like a dissonant chord. It didn't resonate with light or dark, yet it disturbed the Force deeply. He could sense the growing devotion among Outer Rim populations. Myth-making was underway, and the galaxy's balance was already tipping. The galaxy was learning that Homelander had arrived. Fear, awe, and devotion were spreading, and with them, the first real challenge to the Empire's control outside the core worlds. The Outer Rim would never be the same. The systems around Karen's reach had quieted, but not in peace. They had quieted because everyone knew better than to act openly against him. The destruction of Imperial posts, the collapse of criminal enclaves, and the mere presence of Homelander had shifted the political gravity of the Outer Rim. Communication networks that had once linked planetary governors, crime lords, and even local militias were now strained with conflicting reports. Some reported him as a liberator, some as a tyrant. None fully understood him. None could predict what he would do next. Homelander, floating effortlessly above the ruins of Karen's reach, scanned the horizon. The wind carried the acrid smell of scorched metal and burned ozone. The dust and smoke reflected the setting suns in jagged beams, creating a stage for what would soon be the next act. And he could feel the currents of fear, the trembling of the weak, the cautious respect of the strong. Everything was operating according to plan. And yet, he knew he was being watched. The Empire had begun organizing a response, slow and methodical as usual. Palpatine had decided that engagement with Homelander required a mixture of diplomacy, observation, and strategic deterrence. The Emperor had dispatched a fleet under the command of a Moff, whose reputation for ruthlessness and cunning was nearly unmatched in the Outer Rim. Alongside him traveled several Inquisitors and elite stormtrooper contingents, units trained to suppress Force-sensitive threats, though Homelander was not Force-sensitive in any conventional sense. Vader, aware of the anomaly's growing influence, had joined them off in a tactical briefing aboard a Star Destroyer orbiting the Karen system. "He is not of our galaxy," Vader said, his voice deep and commanding. "He does not resonate with the Force. Yet his power dwarfs our weapons. Any direct engagement would be catastrophic." The Moff, sweating slightly despite the chill of the ship's bridge, nodded. "We cannot allow him to continue. If he consolidates Outer Rim loyalty, the core worlds will eventually feel his influence. Systems may defect before we can even respond." Palpatine's voice crackled over the comm. "Observation first. Study him. Let him demonstrate his philosophy and method. Then, when the time is right, we will bend him to our will, or destroy him in ways that leave no question of our superiority." Vader remained silent, and he understood the Emperor's calculus. Patience could be a weapon as deadly as a lightsaber, but he also knew the anomaly would continue to grow, gaining followers, myth, and influence with each act of domination. Not all factions were paralyzed. Hidden deep in the industrial sectors of nearby systems, rebel cells had begun to organize. They knew they could not confront Homelander directly. Their weapons were primitive, their numbers insufficient. Instead, they relied on intelligence, infiltration, and guerrilla strategy. Kyle Torin and Vira Nos had spent hours coordinating with other cells, analyzing his patterns. "He's not invincible," Kyle said, "but conventional tactics are useless. We need to make him overextend. We need to create friction in his narrative." Vera shook her head. "Friction against him is dangerous. For every misstep, and he'll crush entire systems. We don't just risk ourselves, we risk thousands of lives." Kyle's eyes were hard. "Do you think the Empire will protect them? Do you think the Hutts care? We are the only ones with the ability to manipulate his path, subtle though it may be. That's our leverage." The rebels began distributing propaganda in secret, spreading doubts and half-truths among outer systems, and subtly encouraging Imperial or criminal forces to overreact, forcing Homelander into situations where his response could be observed, tested, or exploited. It did not take long for Homelander to sense a coordinated effort. Reports of small skirmishes reached him, minor Imperial patrols attempting to track his movement, smugglers spreading false intel, and rebel operatives creating small disturbances. Each act was measured, precise, and frustratingly clever. He decided it was time for a demonstration. He descended on a minor industrial planet where rumors of rebellion activity had begun to solidify. The air was thick with smog and the acrid scent of chemical processing plants. Factories lined the horizon, with Imperial supervisors and local laborers rushing to maintain operations under his unpredictable gaze. He moved silently above the ground, then accelerated into motion. Within moments, he had neutralized patrol squads, incapacitated surveillance droids, and created visible demonstrations of power designed to awe and intimidate. Yet he did not slaughter indiscriminately. Precision, spectacle, and narrative were key. The rebels, watching from hidden vantage points, observed how he operated. He punished inefficiency, rewarded obedience, and manipulated perception with the skill of a tactician and the instincts of a predator. "This is beyond anything we anticipated," Vara whispered. "He's perfect at controlling narrative." Kyle adjusted his visor. "Then we make him imperfect. We force choices that he cannot control completely. That's the only way to level the playing field." Meanwhile, the Imperial fleet continued its approach. Star destroyers loomed in the skies above several systems, observing but not engaging. Vader felt the anomaly in the Force like a dissonant chord, simultaneously fascinating and threatening. He could sense fear and awe radiating from Homelander, but no attachment to the Force itself. It was as if the currents of the galaxy flowed around him, bending to a will that was alien in nature. Vader convened a tactical council. Engagement must be calculated. He is not Force-sensitive in any conventional sense. His strength, speed, and durability exceed our technological projections. Yet he reacts to narrative, to perception. That is his weakness. Exploit it. The Moff nodded, though unease shadowed his features. "We have no guarantees. If we act prematurely, entire sectors may rebel or defect in panic. Observation is our only option." Palpatine's voice cut through the calm again. "Do not fear my apprentice. Study him, observe him. Let him believe he is the apex, Then, when the time is right, we will bend him or annihilate him completely. As Homelander continued his methodical domination of Outer Rim systems, he encountered a scenario that challenged his instincts. A local planetary governor had attempted to hide several thousand civilians in industrial complexes, hoping to prevent collateral damage. Homelander discovered the operation, and the decision before him was simple, yet morally complex. Strike indiscriminately, demonstrating his dominance, or allow their evacuation, preserving life but reducing the spectacle. He hesitated, not for morality's sake, but for narrative. The universe was a stage, and the story he told mattered. He observed the civilians fleeing, the governor's panic, and decided precision. He struck only the military and security elements, leaving the civilians unharmed. The result was striking. Fear remained, respect grew, and a subtle loyalty began to take root. Observers noted his choice, not as altruism, but as calculated control. Even those who opposed him could not deny the pattern. Homelander was meticulous, terrifying, and strategic, a predator playing a game most did not realize existed. With each action, Homelander reshaped the Outer Rim. Criminal syndicates learned caution, Imperial governors reassessed loyalty and preparedness, and rebel cells recalculated strategy. Myth, power, and perception had become intertwined. He did not just conquer systems, he altered the psychology of entire populations, creating a gravitational pull that rivaled even the Empire's influence. On several worlds, the citizens began forming small cults around him, reverent yet fearful. Pilots, laborers, and administrators whispered stories of a godlike figure who could appear anywhere, strike instantly, and vanish without a trace. For the myth was spreading faster than any official Imperial narrative could counter, and even the Hutts began to murmur of divine wrath. Homelander sensed observation once again. A squad of Mandalorians, elite trackers, and hunters of the highest skill had shadowed his movements across several systems. He allowed them to follow, curious how a disciplined warrior culture would respond to a being of pure dominance. He addressed them directly, using disrupted communications channels. "I know you're watching. You could strike, but you haven't. Why?" A measured voice from a helmet responded, "We measure strength, not fear. You are interesting." Homelander smiled. "Interesting keeps life exciting." The standoff remained tense, orbiting a barren asteroid where each faction tested limits. Mandalorians were formidable, their weapons capable of piercing conventional armor, but his alien physiology defied analysis. Every tactic they employed was anticipated, countered, or absorbed with minimal effort. In the end, the Mandalorians withdrew, leaving evidence of surveillance devices, each destroyed silently by Homelander. By the end of the session, Homelander had established a pattern of strategic domination across the Outer Rim. He remained untouchable in combat, precise in action, and methodical in cultivating myth. Imperial fleets observed, Vader plotted, Palpatine schemed, rebels countered with guerrilla tactics, and criminal syndicates withdrew into shadow. The galaxy was no longer simply reacting. It was learning that Homelander had arrived, reshaping Outer Rim politics, perception, and power structures with every move. Fear, awe, and worship intertwined, creating a new gravitational center in the galaxy's periphery. And he was just beginning. The outer rim was no longer a quiet backwater. Every system Homelander touched hummed with the reverberations of fear, awe, and whispered stories. Holo-recordings, smuggler feeds, and clandestine transmissions had transformed him into a living legend. Entire planetary administrations were paralyzed with indecision. To resist was suicidal. To comply was submission, and to flee was to invite chaos in their wake. Imperial intelligence had taken stock. Reports were collated, patterns analyzed, but the data was insufficient. Even the most skilled tacticians could not fully anticipate his decisions, his speed, or his willpower. Vader felt it in the Force, a presence unaligned, unbendable, and deeply alien. Yet Vader also recognized the strategic openings created by Homelander's insistence on spectacle and narrative. Yet every time he displayed restraint, mercy, or precision, he revealed a method to his madness. On the industrial world of Ceres Prime, Kyle Torin and Vira Nos convened with allied cells. Holomaps displayed Imperial patrols, civilian movements, and Homelander's predicted trajectories. Every strike he had made, every calculated mercy, had left breadcrumbs. Kyle spoke, his voice low but sharp. He's predictable if we study him carefully. His pattern isn't random. He calculates fear and loyalty in real time, weighing outcomes before acting. If we force a moral choice that conflicts with his narrative, we can disrupt him. Vera shook her head. That's dangerous. One wrong move and thousands die. We're not just fighting him. We're gambling with entire systems. Kale's jaw tightened. Then we gamble smart. Distraction, subtlety, and timing. We don't need to win in combat. We need to create imperfection. The rebels began distributing misinformation, staging minor crises designed to compel him to intervene in ways that revealed weaknesses in his narrative control. Their strategy relied not on weapons but on perception, forcing Homelander to act decisively in morally complex situations that could undermine his influence. Above the outer rim, Vader convened with a council of officers aboard the Executor. Holo-recordings from Ceres Prime and Karen's Reach were displayed. Stormtroopers had been neutralized without casualties, patrols disrupted with surgical precision, and civilian populations increasingly rallied to his myth. He is beyond conventional tactics, Vader said, voice resonating through the command chamber. Yet every action leaves a trace. Observe. He analyze and exploit perception, force conflicting outcomes. That is our advantage. The Moff, sweating under the cold lights, nodded. We have no guarantees. One miscalculation, and entire sectors may defect. Observation is our only safe course. Palpatine's voice hissed through the calm. Patience, my apprentice. Let him demonstrate his philosophy, his cruelty, his spectacle. Then we shall bend or break him. The galaxy will remember who controls all power. Vader remained silent. Patience was necessary, but each day allowed Homelander's influence to grow. Homelander arrived on Rylock Thaf, a critical industrial hub where rebel cells had staged a complex network of resistance and sabotage. His superhuman speed allowed him to survey the situation in seconds. The planet's orbital defenses were operational but insufficient. The ground-based militia and security forces had attempted minor ambushes, all of which failed spectacularly. He descended to the Central Industrial District, a massive expanse of factories, warehouses, and sprawling habitable zones. Smoke and chemical haze hung in the air, mingling with the sounds of industrial machinery. Blaster fire echoed from rebel positions, but he moved faster than sight, neutralizing threats with precision that bordered on theatrical. Rebels watched from hidden vantage points, hearts pounding. Kyle whispered, "This is the test. Watch how he responds to moral ambiguity." Homelander observed the civilians trapped between Imperial patrols and rebel fire. A choice presented itself. He could strike indiscriminately to demonstrate dominance, potentially killing hundreds, or target only the combatants, leaving civilians unharmed. He chose precision. Military threats were neutralized swiftly, civilians allowed to evacuate. The message was clear: absolute control, tempered by selective restraint. Even opponents began to recognize his method. Homelander's presence reshaped not only territory but perception. Criminal syndicates learned caution, Imperial governors adjusted strategies, and rebels recalibrated tactics. Stories of his decisions, mercy tempered by devastation, spread faster than the actual events. Entire systems began forming myths around him, blending fear, awe, and reverence. Vader sensed the subtle shift in the Force. Populations were responding more to myth than power. His presence created a psychological gravity beyond physical threats. Every moral choice he made became a lesson, a warning, and a narrative to exploit. The Empire continued to observe, analyze, and calculate. Star Destroyers shadowed his movements, but they did not engage. Palpatine's fascination with the anomaly had become a dangerous obsession, a tool to be harnessed, a threat to be controlled. A squad of Mandalorians, elite trackers and warriors, had followed Homelander's trajectory across several systems. His speed and adaptability allowed him to anticipate their movements. Yet he did not strike. The Mandalorians were not enemies. They were observers, testing his capabilities and patience. Through disrupted communications channels, he addressed them. "I know you're watching. You could strike, but you haven't. Why?" A measured voice replied, "We measure strength, not fear. You are interesting." Homelander smiled. Interesting keeps life exciting. The standoff remained tense. The Mandalorian tactics were sophisticated, but he countered or absorbed every move. Eventually they withdrew, leaving traces of surveillance equipment, each destroyed silently. The Mandalorians' respect and caution was evident, even in retreat. By now, Homelander's influence had spread across multiple systems. Civilians revered him, rebels feared and studied him, and the Empire meticulously tracked his movements. Every act of controlled destruction, every calculated mercy, amplified the mythos surrounding him. On planets where he had intervened, minor cults began to form, blending superstition with observation. Pilots, laborers, and administrators whispered stories of his presence, each tale slightly different, but all acknowledging his dominion. Even the Hutts, masters of negotiation and intimidation, muttered prayers in fear. They're recognizing his incomprehensible power. The Outer Rim's political landscape was shifting. Loyalty was no longer based on imperial or criminal enforcement. It was dictated by perception, narrative, and the inevitable presence of a being who defied conventional power structures. The rebels recognized the danger. Kyle Torin convened a council of cells across multiple systems. "We cannot stop him in combat," he said, "but we can force him to overextend, create moral conflicts, and exploit perception. That is our only leverage." Imperial commanders continued to observe. Vader, sensing the alien current through the Force, understood that Homelander's next moves would ripple across the galaxy. Every choice, every act of restraint or aggression offered insight into potential vulnerabilities. Palpatine's scheming deepened. The anomaly had become more than a curiosity. It was a test of control, influence, and strategic patience. The Emperor's obsession was evident in every directive issued to Imperial governors and fleets in the Outer Rim. Conclusion of Session 5. By the end of Session 5, Homelander had solidified his psychological and physical dominion over several Outer Rim systems. Fear, awe, and reverence had intertwined to form a new gravitational center of influence. Imperial fleets observed cautiously, rebels plotted subversively, and criminal syndicates remained in hiding. Yet the galaxy's core remained untouched. The balance of power was delicate. Each system conquered, each narrative shaped, drew Homelander closer to a confrontation that could redefine the galaxy. And in the shadows, the seeds of rebellion, observation, fear, and strategic resistance were beginning to converge. He was untouchable, methodical, and calculating. But even gods faced challenges. The Outer Rim had become Homelander's proving ground. Yet now the core worlds began to stir. Reports flowed in from systems across the periphery. Minor planetary leaders claiming loyalty, small-scale uprisings quelled without casualties, and entire industrial sectors reoriented toward his unpredictable influence. Every planet that bent beneath his shadow contributed to a mounting tide of fear and awe, one that threatened to ripple into the Republic's, or Imperial, central command structures. Above the industrial planet of Charon Prime, Imperial star destroyers observed cautiously. Their holoscreens displayed Homelander's trajectory, his known interventions, and the peripheral shifts in planetary behavior. Vader, standing before the bridge officers, exhaled slowly, the Force buzzing with an energy unfamiliar and unnerving. He has become a storm that cannot be controlled through conventional means, Vader said, voice low and resonant. Every action leaves traces of power, precision, and narrative dominance. Every choice is calculated to maximize both influence and fear. He tests the limits of strategy itself. Amoff hesitated, then asked, "Can he be contained, my lord?" Vader's eyes narrowed, the shadow of his mask reflecting the cold star field. Observation alone is insufficient. Containment requires understanding his motives, anticipating his moral calculations, and exploiting perception. That is the only leverage we have. Yet leverage is temporary. One error, one hesitation, and the galaxy changes forever. Palpatine's voice hissed over the comm channel. Patience. He is a tool and a test. Let him shape perception. Let him demonstrate power. And then we shall bend or break him. Only then will the galaxy recognize true authority. In the industrial corridors of Rylock 5, Kyle Torin studied holo-recordings of Homelander's latest interventions. The Rebel network had observed patterns, minor choices, and narrative preferences. His partiality for minimizing civilian casualties, his ruthless efficiency against combatants, and the way he manipulated perception to generate both fear and loyalty. "This is our only path," Kyle said, pointing at overlapping holomaps of multiple systems. "We cannot defeat him in combat, but we can force moral dilemmas, exploit perception, and create conflicts that even he cannot resolve without risk. Each choice he makes leaves a fissure we can widen." Varanos, her brow furrowed, interjected, "If we fail, thousands die, and if he anticipates us, the cost multiplies exponentially." Kyle's voice hardened. "Then we calculate better, manipulate better, and force him to overextend. Victory isn't about physical dominance, it's about narrative control, and we have the advantage there, just enough to probe for cracks." Rebel cells dispatched coded misinformation, orchestrated feints, and manipulated local Imperial and criminal networks to create subtle crises. Their plan was to force Homelander into situations where no choice could satisfy all variables, and where morality and consequence became intertwined in unpredictable ways. On Karen Prime's surface, Homelander descended into the central industrial complex. Smoke from refineries and factories hung thick in the atmosphere, obscuring patrols and rebel positions. Imperial forces attempted to organize defensive formations, while rebel teams staged diversions and false intelligence grids. He moved with inhuman speed, neutralizing threats as quickly as they appeared. Blaster fire, turbo lasers, and automated drones were rendered obsolete within seconds. Yet every movement was precise, designed not merely to subdue, but to command narrative perception. Civilians were protected where possible, enemies were incapacitated or destroyed with surgical efficiency, and the aftermath left a psychological imprint that further solidified his myth. The rebels observed from hidden positions, adrenaline taut. Kyle whispered, "Watch closely. Every choice, every precision strike, every moment of restraint is a lesson, and every lesson leaves a trace we can manipulate." Meanwhile, a squad of Mandalorian trackers, elite in both stealth and combat, trailed Homelander across 3 systems. They tested his reactions with traps, ambushes, and simulated assaults. Each encounter was calculated, yet he responded flawlessly. Through a communication channel, disrupted intentionally to mask coordinates, Homelander addressed them. "You've followed me this far. You could strike, but you haven't. Why?" The leader's helmeted voice replied, "We measure strength, not fear. You are intriguing." Homelander's smile was predatory. Intriguing keeps life exciting. The standoff escalated across asteroid belts, orbital debris, and industrial sprawl. Mandalorian tactics were sophisticated, but each maneuver was anticipated or absorbed without direct confrontation. Eventually, the trackers withdrew, leaving evidence of their observation. The Homelander's dominance was recognized even by those whose culture revolved around war and discipline. Homelander faced increasingly complex moral choices. On Ceres Prime, Imperial commanders attempted to bait him with civilian hostages. The dilemma was stark: strike indiscriminately and assert dominance, risking thousands of lives, or act with surgical precision, protecting civilians but potentially undermining the spectacle he needed to control perception. He chose precision. Military targets were neutralized, civilians remained safe, and the resulting narrative reinforced both fear and awe. The observers, Imperial, rebel, and criminal alike, recognized that his method was as much about psychological control as physical power. Rebel leaders, watching from hidden positions, recalibrated strategies. Kyle noted, "He weaponizes morality as a tactical tool. Terrifying, yes, but predictable. If we manipulate perception, we can create cracks." Above Karen Prime, Vader convened with Imperial officers. Holo recordings revealed Homelander's calculated restraint, and lethal precision. Stormtroopers and automated defenses were rendered ineffective. Civilian casualties were minimized, amplifying narrative influence. "He is beyond conventional engagement," Vader said, hand on his lightsaber hilt. "Yet he leaves traces, patterns in his decision-making, exploit perception, force conflicting moral choices, and observe adaptation. That is our only strategy." A Moff, voice quivering, asked, "How long before he reaches the core worlds?" Vader's response was measured. Every system conquered, every narrative solidified, brings him closer. But one misstep, one carefully crafted dilemma, and the balance can shift. Observation, patience, and exploitation of perception are our only weapons. Homelander had consolidated his influence across multiple Outer Rim systems. Criminal syndicates retreated, rebels observed and probed, and Imperial fleets monitored cautiously. Civilians whispered of a godlike figure, weaving myth into everyday life. Perception and narrative were now inseparable from power. Homelander did not merely command the battlefield. He commanded belief. Systems bent under the weight of his myth, his moral precision, and his inhuman capabilities. Vader felt the alien current in the Force, recognizing that each new system brought Homelander closer to a confrontation that could redefine galactic politics. Palpatine's obsession deepened. The anomaly was no longer merely a curiosity. It was a threat, a tool, and a test of patience and control. Homelander's next moves would inevitably bring him closer to the core worlds, where both Imperial authority and rebel organization would intersect at full strength. Every calculated intervention, every moral choice, every demonstration of power and precision pushed the Outer Rim into alignment, or fear-driven compliance. Observation, patience, and strategic manipulation were no longer abstract. They were essential for survival. Imperial fleets, rebel cells, and criminal networks understood that the next stage of engagement would determine the balance of galactic influence. Homelander, methodical, calculating, and untouchable, prepared for this next phase. Even gods, however, face limits. Physical, psychological, and strategic. And the galaxy was beginning to set the stage for a confrontation that would test every skill, every choice, and every narrative he had built. The coreward route from the Outer Rim was no longer quiet. Homelander moved with a calculated urgency, his presence drawing attention from both Imperial command and the scattered rebel cells desperate to anticipate his actions. Planets along the hyperspace lanes adjusted automatically, fleets repositioning themselves at the first rumor of his arrival. On the industrial hub of Kessel Prime, entire sectors paused production as news arrived. A godlike being was approaching, and no one could predict his next decision. Above the planet, an Imperial-class Star Destroyer hung in orbit. Vader stood on the bridge, the Force swirling around him with an unfamiliar resonance. Oh, it was not the dark presence of the Emperor or the light of a Jedi. It was something alien, impossibly focused, and untouchable. The presence resonated across hyperspace, as though the galaxy itself recognized a new axis of power. He could anticipate tactics, predict moral choices, and simultaneously manipulate perception across multiple sectors. "This is no ordinary anomaly," Vader said. His voice carried a cold certainty. "Every move he makes shapes outcomes across the system. Observation is not enough. We must force choices he cannot reconcile, conflicts where morality becomes a weapon against him. Amoph's voice wavered, and if he anticipates them? Vader's gaze narrowed. Then we adapt. But patience is our only weapon until we discover leverage. On the surface, rebel strategists scrambled to implement contingency plans. Kyle Torin convened a council of cells across several systems via encrypted holocoms. "We cannot match him in combat," he said. But perception is malleable. Narrative can be disrupted, moral choices can be manipulated, and even he must calculate consequences. We create situations where every choice carries cost, and we let him reveal himself in full. Viranos's brow was tight with worry. One misstep, and thousands die, and if he adapts too quickly, we'll have nothing to exploit. Kyle's eyes burned with resolve. Then we move carefully. Every crisis is calculated to reveal patterns. Every moral decision is a test. This is our only advantage. Rebel cells moved in shadow, planting misinformation, engineering diversions, and manipulating local criminal networks to create complex, unavoidable dilemmas. Each signal, every whisper, was designed to force him into a choice where no outcome could be without consequence. The first direct confrontation came near the mining colonies of Rylock Expanse. Homelander descended from hyperspace, his arrival marked not by sound, but by the subtle vibration of gravitational waves bending around him. Automated orbital defenses flared to life, but their fire was insignificant against his speed and strength. He moved across the colonies with terrifying precision. Combatants were neutralized before they could draw weapons, civilians were spared, and the afterimage of his actions left an indelible psychological mark on every observer. Rebels and Imperial agents alike recorded everything. Each decision he made was scrutinized, every restraint catalogued, and every act of destruction memorized. Kyle murmured to Vera, "He doesn't just fight. He enforces a narrative. Even mercy becomes a weapon in his hands." On the fringes of the colony, Mandalorian trackers shadowed his movements. Their approach had been cautious, designed to measure and test rather than engage. Each trap they set, explosives, hidden turbo-laser arrays, coordinated ambushes, was neutralized before it could harm a single civilian. Homelander confronted them directly, speaking across disrupted comm channels. "I know you're watching. You could strike, but you haven't. Why?" The leader's voice, calm and measured, replied, "We measure strength, not fear. You're noteworthy." Homelander's smile was slow, predatory. Noteworthy keeps life interesting. They withdrew, leaving behind evidence of their observation. Even the most disciplined warriors of Mandalore recognized that his dominance was not just physical. It was strategic, not psychological, and absolute. The tension between factions escalated further as Imperial forces attempted to manipulate planetary leaders into a coordinated defense. Vader's subtle strategy relied on forcing Homelander into morally complex scenarios. On Ceres Prime, civilian hostages were positioned in such a way as to tempt him into indiscriminate destruction. Yet as he had before, he acted with surgical precision, neutralizing threats without collateral damage. This created a paradox. Fear spread, but so did admiration. Civilians and insurgents alike began to shape behavior around him. Criminal syndicates and minor warlords retreated to the shadows, unwilling to challenge a being who could obliterate entire patrols in seconds while maintaining moral dominance. In orbital space, The Empire's calculations were meticulous. Palpatine had ordered surveillance fleets and intelligence probes across multiple systems, each gathering data, each analyzing patterns. Homelander's every action was recorded, yet every new system seemed to widen the gap between perception and predictability. Vader, ever methodical, recognized the danger. A being who manipulated morality, perception, and fear simultaneously was more than a threat. It was a new axis of galactic power. At the same time, rebels exploited the cracks in his decision-making. Strategic diversions forced him to overextend, moral dilemmas challenged his approach, and misinformation created scenarios where any choice would carry consequences. Each small success fed their hope, but the cost was high. Every delay, every misjudgment could result in thousands of deaths. Homelander's path continued through the Outer Rim, moving systematically toward the core. Civilian populations adjusted behavior instantly, learning to navigate around his interventions. Entire systems bent subconsciously, aligning with the narrative he imposed. Even Imperial governors, far from the front lines, began to implement emergency protocols designed to anticipate his moral calculations. As he approached the industrial planets of Karran Reach, the convergence of factions became inevitable. Rebel cells coordinated across multiple sectors, Imperial fleets shadowed from orbit, and Mandalorian trackers continued their silent observation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only strength and strategy, but the very perception of morality, choice and consequence in the galaxy. At the heart of the industrial sectors, civilians moved with caution, aware of the approaching figure who could reshape their lives in an instant. Factories and refineries were evacuated where possible, military squads repositioned, rebels readied contingency plans, Homelander's footsteps carried across the terrain. A storm contained within a single presence. Every choice he made, whether to strike, restrain, or manipulate perception, resonated across the sector. Civilians whispered tales of godlike intervention. Rebels and Imperial agents cataloged patterns, adapting strategies, calculating probabilities. Myth and reality intertwined. He was as much a symbol as he was a force. For several hours, the industrial district became a theater of controlled chaos. Rebels orchestrated small-scale diversions. Imperial patrols attempted containment, and Homelander moved seamlessly between them. Every threat was neutralized, every civilian spared, and every observation recorded. By the end of the cycle, multiple factions had experienced firsthand the full scope of his capabilities: precision, speed, moral calculation, and narrative control. Yet even in this display of power, cracks began to emerge. Subtle moral dilemmas, conflicting priorities, and unanticipated consequences forced him to make decisions that weighed heavily on perception and outcome. Factions began to sense that while he was unstoppable physically, there were spaces where strategic manipulation could challenge him. Across the coreward hyperspace lanes, the news of his actions spread rapidly. Hollow transmissions and encrypted channels carried tales of surgical strikes, moral precision, and mythic influence. Systems once neutral or hesitant began preparing contingency plans, adjusting fleets, and disseminating strategic advisories. Both Imperial and Rebel leadership recognized that the next phase would be decisive, a convergence of factions where Homelander's narrative dominance would be tested against combined forces. The stage was set for the ultimate intersection of speed, morality, perception, and strategy. Civilian populations, criminal syndicates, rebel cells, and Imperial fleets awaited the next move, each aware that the galaxy itself was being reshaped by a presence beyond comprehension. The core-word hyperspace lanes buzzed with tension, a web of anticipation that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Every Imperial Star destroyer, every rebel cruiser, and every covert vessel in the Outer Rim had received word of Homelander's advance. Reports of his surgical strikes, precise moral calculus, and mythic influence had reached even the most insulated systems. On Karen Prime, industrial complexes lay in uneasy silence, their factories idle, refineries shuttered, and civilians confined to reinforced shelters. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the galaxy had seen in centuries. From orbit, Vader stood before the command viewport of his star destroyer, observing Homelander's approach. The Force was alive with alien resonance, a ripple that defied dark or light categorization. This presence was not bound by the same laws that governed Jedi or Sith. It calculated, anticipated, and manipulated simultaneously across moral, strategic, and psychological vectors. Vader's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his lightsaber, though he knew that mere reflex and strength would not suffice. This was a battle of perception as much as power, one that could redefine the balance of the galaxy. "Converge the fleets," Vader commanded. "We must test him, draw him into the core sectors, and force choices he cannot reconcile. Observation is insufficient. He must be confronted on every vector, every system, every civilian, every narrative must be positioned to challenge him simultaneously." Imperial officers scrambled to coordinate orbital deployments, deploying interceptors, positioning battalions on planetary surfaces, and readying siege weapons calibrated for rapid suppression. They hoped to create overlapping tactical dilemmas where any move Homelander made would force trade-offs with perception, morality, or collateral consequence. In parallel, Kyle Torin gathered his rebel cells in hidden bunkers across the Outer Rim. Holo-recordings streamed from multiple systems, Homelander neutralizing patrols, dismantling fortifications, and imposing order without excessive force. The pattern was terrifyingly consistent. "We cannot match him in direct combat," Kyle said, voice tense but resolute. "But we can force situations where every choice carries a cost. Every moral decision, every act of restraint or aggression becomes a lever we can manipulate. His precision is unmatched, but even gods must weigh consequences." Vera Noss, her expression grim, replied, "If he sees through our manipulations too quickly, thousands will die. And if he interprets our traps as intentional, he may accelerate toward the core before we are ready." Kyle's eyes narrowed. "Then we multiply the dilemmas, create intersecting conflicts across multiple systems. We control perception, even if we cannot control him." Rebel teams moved with unparalleled coordination, engineering crises across coreward sectors, sabotaged communication relays, falsified intelligence, and orchestrated skirmishes forced Homelander to calculate outcomes on multiple fronts. Every move he made, every decision, was tracked, analyzed, and anticipated in return. As Homelander descended on the industrial sprawl of Karen Reach, the culmination of preparation became tangible. Imperial battalions, rebel militias, and covert Mandalorian trackers positioned themselves across strategic locations. Automated turrets flared, droid patrols formed precise grids, and civilian shelters were reinforced to create ethical dilemmas for Homelander's interventions. He moved faster than the eye could follow. Blaster fire, energy shields, and tactical maneuvers were neutralized with surgical precision. Imperial battalions collapsed before they could organize, yet no civilian was harmed. Rebel cells found their diversions and misdirections dismantled almost instantly. Mandalorian trackers attempted coordinated ambushes, but even their most sophisticated traps were anticipated and nullified. Every action reinforced Homelander's myth. Fear and admiration intertwined in the same breath. Civilians whispered his name as a godlike protector, and soldiers murmured about invincibility, and spies documented his every movement for future analysis. The critical confrontation arrived when Imperial forces attempted to exploit civilians as moral bait. On the surface, hostages were positioned deliberately to force Homelander into compromise, either strike and risk innocent lives, or spare civilians and allow heavily armed battalions to advance. He moved with uncanny deliberation, neutralizing combatants without harming a single hostage. Blasters were ripped from hands mid-firing, droids disassembled in microseconds, and armored squads rendered immobile with precision that left no collateral damage. His choice reverberated across multiple factions. The Empire recognized restraint, rebels recognized principle, and civilians recognized protection. But yet the moral calculus extended beyond simple restraint. Homelander's presence forced factions to question their own ethics. Imperial commanders debated whether aggressive tactics were justified. Rebels reevaluated the cost of deception, and Mandalorians considered the efficacy of honor versus survival. Every calculation became a tool in his strategic arsenal, a ripple that magnified influence without a single strike. Vader, recognizing that indirect manipulation alone would not suffice, descended in his TIE-class fighter to engage directly. Hyperspace coordinates were recalculated, and battle droids formed defensive grids to support him. Homelander's speed made initial exchanges almost imperceptible. Blaster bolts evaporated in mid-air. Turbo laser blasts were deflected with minimal effort, and even lightsaber strikes were predicted and avoided. Vader's force-enhanced reflexes allowed him to land glancing blows, but Homelander's alien physiology absorbed and countered with near-perfect anticipation. Every action by Vader triggered immediate adaptation. For the first time, the Dark Lord sensed hesitation in his opponent. Not fear, but calculation. Homelander was not merely reacting. He was integrating moral, strategic, and physical vectors simultaneously. The battle escalated across orbital platforms, industrial zones, and urban districts. Imperial bombers were neutralized mid-drop, rebel ships rerouted to avoid destruction, and civilians evacuated under a haze of controlled chaos. Homelander's dominance was complete, yet every step forward created new dilemmas. Every choice carved a moral signature into the unfolding narrative. Kale Torin's plan reached its apex. Coordinated sabotage across multiple sectors forced Homelander into intersecting crises. An industrial explosion threatened a civilian district. Imperial patrols advanced, and rebel operatives staged a hostage extraction simultaneously. Each scenario carried moral consequences that would ripple through perception. Homelander calculated with terrifying speed. He neutralized the industrial threat, incapacitated Imperial patrols, and rescued hostages without a single life lost. The rebels watched in disbelief. Even when forced into impossible decisions, he maintained absolute control. Yet subtle overextensions began to appear. Microseconds of vulnerability, the faintest hesitation when calculating intersecting outcomes. Agile leaned forward. That hesitation, we exploit that. Push him further, force a compounded choice, and even gods hesitate when morality conflicts with perception. The Mandalorian trackers returned, this time in a coordinated strike from multiple orbital vectors. Their weapons, cloaked and enhanced with experimental tech, targeted vulnerabilities previously observed in Homelander's engagements. Yet even these measures were anticipated. He intercepted incoming projectiles with near-zero reaction time, moving faster than sight allowed, and redirected attacks to create minimal disruption. Still, the Mandalorians noted micro-chinks in his approach, subtle delays in risk assessment, brief overcalculations in ethical priority, and split-second conflicts when multiple crises intersected. And these observations would become critical in future confrontations. As the engagement continued, the galaxy itself seemed to respond to his presence. Systems bent subconsciously. Perception shaped allegiance, and myth replaced chain of command. Rebel and Imperial leaders alike realized that even combined forces could not impose conventional victory. The battlefield became a theater of moral complexity and psychological strategy, with Homelander at the center. Even Palpatine, observing remotely, acknowledged the anomaly. His voice hissed over encrypted channels. An untouchable variable, patience and manipulation are required. One misstep, and the galaxy itself bends to him. Vader's recognition was similar, tempered with a mixture of respect and caution. This confrontation was not just physical, it was ethical, psychological, and galactic in scope. In the heart of Karen Reach, Homelander confronted the compounded crises: industrial explosions, hostage situations, orbital bombardments, and rebel diversions. Every scenario carried irreversible consequences. Every moral choice was weighted against perception, strategy, and collateral consequence. He paused, calculating simultaneously across multiple planes of reality. In one fluid sequence, he neutralized industrial threats, saved hostages, incapacitated advancing Imperial forces, and dismantled rebel diversions. Each act was precise, deliberate, and unflinchingly moral. Observers across factions realized the truth. No matter how they manipulated, deceived, or challenged him, Homelander's calculus was inhuman. He was a being of alien ethics, unmatched perception, and surgical execution. The battlefield fell silent. Smoke and haze cleared. Civilians emerged from shelters. Rebel cells cataloged their failures and marginal successes. Imperial fleets regrouped, recalculating engagement protocols. Mandalorians retreated to report, analyzing every microsecond of observation. Homelander, standing amid the ruins of orchestrated chaos, remained untouched, unflinching, and morally resolute. Myth and reality had converged in his presence, and the galaxy itself seemed to bend subtly around his influence. The Corward approach now loomed inevitable. His control of perception, morality, and strategy had reached a zenith. Every faction recognized that direct confrontation alone would not suffice. Every engagement had been a test of ethical, psychological, and tactical mastery. The stage was set for the final act, a confrontation not just of power, but of narrative, influence, and the very principle of choice in a galaxy struggling to maintain its balance. The coreward systems lay in uneasy stillness. From the vantage of orbital platforms circling Karen Reach, the remnants of industrial smoke and scorched battlefields drifted across the horizon. Civilians emerged cautiously, their eyes scanning the skies for the figure that had dominated every decision, every outcome, and every perception. Homelander's presence had transformed the Outer Rim into a theater of myth, a crucible where morality, fear, and awe intertwined to shape allegiance and obedience alike. Even now, he stood at the apex of this fragile equilibrium, a being whose power was absolute, yet whose influence was defined as much by ethical precision as by raw strength. The forces arrayed against him, Imperial battalions, rebel militias, Mandalorian trackers, and covert criminal factions, had all been tested, measured, and observed. Each confrontation had left traces, minor cracks in strategy, subtle overextensions, and fleeting hesitation. Yet none had imposed limits. From orbit, Vader monitored the planetary grid, his presence in the Force extending through the battlefield like a shadow. The alien resonance that accompanied Homelander was undeniable, a force beyond light or dark, a calculus of moral, physical, and psychological mastery. Vader's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the outcomes of every engagement, every choice that had challenged Imperial authority and rebel subterfuge alike. He is not a threat in the conventional sense, Vader said, voice echoing in the command chamber. He is a constant. His power cannot be contained by fleets, weapons, or strategy alone. That only perception and narrative can be manipulated, and even that is limited. A Moff stepped forward, uneasy. And if he turns toward the core worlds, if he challenges the heart of the Empire itself? Vader's response was calm, deliberate. Then we adapt. But his morality, his precision, and his understanding of consequence will shape every response. One misstep, one failure to anticipate his calculus, and the core will be lost. He is not merely a weapon or a threat. He is a variable that cannot be fully constrained. On the planetary surface, Homelander moved through the industrial ruins with methodical purpose. Civilians gathered at a distance, observing, whispering, and cataloging his every action. Rebel operatives, previously hidden, watched in awe and apprehension. Criminal syndicates had withdrawn, one willing to confront a figure who could neutralize threats without harming innocence, who could assert dominance while maintaining ethical clarity. The factories that had once spewed pollution now lay silent, machinery shattered, yet intact, enough to be restored. It was a testament not to chaos, but to controlled power. Every strike, every intervention had been deliberate. He had neutralized threats with surgical precision, saved lives, and created an enduring psychological impact that would shape allegiance for generations. Kyle Torin, observing from a hidden vantage point, whispered to Vera Noss, "He has redefined the battlefield. It is no longer about soldiers or fleets. It is about perception, morality, and consequence. Every faction we deployed, every trap we set, had only highlighted his ability to command outcomes without unnecessary destruction." Vera exhaled slowly. And yet even gods must face limits. There must be a choice that challenges him beyond calculation. Kyle's eyes lingered on the horizon. We have created a moral labyrinth. Soon he will reach the apex, and then we will see if even he can reconcile absolute power with ethical consequence. Vader convened a strategy council in orbit, summoning the remaining Imperial officers. Holo-recordings displayed Homelander's interventions, orbital bombardments neutralized without civilian harm, battalions incapacitated with minimal engagement, and rebel diversions dismantled before they could execute. He has mastered not only force projection, but perception, Vader said. Every choice is calculated. Every act leaves a narrative imprint. And every narrative shapes obedience, fear, and allegiance. Conventional methods are irrelevant. Only anticipation, psychological manipulation, and ethical leverage remain as tools to constrain him. A tactical officer interjected, voice uncertain. Then how do we engage him? Direct confrontation is impossible. Our fleets are ineffective, our weapons redundant, and yet the core cannot remain isolated. Vader's gaze was unyielding. We create variables, multi-system crises, ethical dilemmas, conflicting priorities. Even he cannot anticipate every human choice, every unpredictable action. That is where the opportunity lies. But any engagement carries risk. Failure will not merely be defeat, it will reshape the galaxy itself. Homelander's journey took him to the heart of Karen Reach's industrial complex, where rebels, Imperials, Darwin Mandalorians had converged, intentionally or otherwise. The compounded crises forced him to evaluate each choice against its cascading consequences. Industrial explosions threatened civilians. Orbital forces advanced with aggressive precision, and rebel cells attempted hostage diversions. His calculus was flawless. He neutralized industrial hazards, incapacitated orbital units without lethal force, and rescued hostages. Every action maintained ethical clarity while asserting dominance. Observers recognized that he was not merely powerful. He was an arbiter of consequence, a force whose decisions shaped morality itself in real time. Mandalorian trackers attempted a coordinated strike, deploying specialized projectile arrays designed to exploit perceived micro-delays in his decision-making. Even this, however, was anticipated. The Homelander redirected incoming attacks with minimal disruption, each movement precise, each choice deliberate. For the first time, a subtle trace of hesitation appeared. Not fear, but calculation under compounded moral pressure. Rebel leaders documented this micro-hesitation, their hope rekindled. Kyle Torin murmured, "Even perfection has its micro-fissures. If we push carefully, we might force a choice no algorithm can resolve." Vader descended in his TIE-class fighter, a calculated escalation to directly challenge Homelander's dominance. The orbital battlefield erupted with laser fire, turbo-laser exchanges, and strategic maneuvers. Homelander moved with impossible speed, neutralizing attacks mid-air, redirecting energy, and maintaining moral precision. Yet for the first time, a direct clash of titanic calculation occurred. Vader's mastery of the Force against Homelander's alien precision. Blaster bolts evaporated mid-flight. Lightsaber strikes met preemptive counters, and orbital bombardments were rerouted with minimal loss. Each move was a test of perception, ethics, and strategy. Vader sensed a variable unlike any he had encountered, a being whose calculus was as much about ethics and consequence as it was about raw power. The engagement escalated over hours. Industrial zones, orbital arrays, and civilian districts became a theater of controlled chaos, each participant aware that the outcome would redefine their understanding of power and morality. The apex came when Homelander faced an impossible scenario. a multi-system simultaneous crisis, engineered by combined Rebel and Imperial strategists.